Welcome, Dennis. Thank you for being here today.
Oh, thank you, Elaine. Nice to be with you.
So before we go a little deeper into the investment strategy side, I want to level set a bit for the audience. You've spent a lot of time working with early stage clinical companies. So for those newer to pharma, what exactly is an early stage clinical company?
Sure. I mean, what's happening in the early stage clinical company space for investors to understand is this is not your Johnson and Johnson or your Takeda Pharmaceuticals, those top 50s. This is really about smaller organizations that have a product, medicine. It has not been tested in humans yet, or it hasn't been approved, or it hasn't been in trial. So it's really early stage.
And once people understand what that stage actually means, how long does it realistically take to move from discovery to commercialization? And what kind of costs are we talking about along the way?
Yeah. What's interesting about that, and this is where consumers who maybe have heavily invested in pharmaceutical or life sciences, a traditional stock, they have to understand if they're going into this early stage clinical, that you're talking about anywhere from, upwards of 10 years or more to go
Mhm.
from development to product launch, release and marketing. And then the other thing to bear in mind is, we're getting upon a really high priced achievement. You can be looking at just under 1 billion now and upwards of 1.5 billion to go from that initial molecule discovery to product, getting it into consumers. So it's
Mhm.
really long, and that's also a reason why people don't understand why medicine costs so much right now.
Yeah.
We are all, as consumers, paying for that development cost. We're also paying for the failures. It takes a lot
Mm.
of money, a lot of effort, big teams to achieve getting you from start to launch.
And given the timeline and cost structure, it naturally raises the question of capital. So for
Mhm.
investors looking at this space today, where do you see the most compelling opportunities in early stage clinical?
Well, again, we're starting to see some of those GLP products coming out of the smaller
Mhm.
pharmaceutical companies. They're either exiting with being acquired or IPO. But one of the interesting things that's going on here is just, how do you take on that cost? Where do you invest? I'd say to anyone that's going into this space versus a traditional stock market play is looking at a lot of patience. Patience
Right.
to there, but the payoffs can be very large. The other
Yeah.
interesting thing or trend we see going on right now is family offices are actually starting to replace the traditional venture capital or acquisition model.
Mhm.
We're also seeing them being more sophisticated, where they actually have business analysts with experience in this space.
And early stage investing isn't really for everyone. Like
No, it's
any
not.
is definitely not.
No,
Any
you have to
warnings?
have the capital and the patience.
Right. Any warnings or guidance that you would offer to investors entering this part of the market?
Well, I'd say, particularly for family office, if you have the means for a long-term investment, they are really worthwhile. The
Uh,
payoffs are significantly larger than a traditional pharmaceutical stock market play. But
mhm.
again, can you afford for that capital to be sitting out there for a while is the big question.
Right. Right. Those are the very basic stuff to consider and very realistic things.
Yeah.
And on top of that, policy seems to be playing a bigger role than ever. How are things like drug price negotiations are changing, reimbursement expectations influencing which early programs actually gets funded?
So that's another thing that's more of that's what the early stage clinical companies needs to start looking at,
Mhm.
behaving differently. We are, at the end of the day, a technology company. So we
Mhm.
need to start behaving like technologies. What's kind of
Yeah.
interesting with the interruptions in market compliance regulatory that's going on is it's really forcing us to behave like a traditional tech. We start looking at agility coming into play. How can you pivot? You start looking at tariff models. How can we avoid those? So you
Mhm.
start thinking globally much sooner. And then also your team structure. changes to reflect that? Do you have the knowledge set on the board, addressing digital, starting to look at pricing? All these things that payer negotiations we didn't really worry about until you were into that traditional pharmaceutical space. We now have to do that much sooner as early stage clinical companies.
So if we are shifting from the investors lens to the operators lens, in 2026, where do you see the real opportunities for those early stage clinical companies?
And I'll hammer it home even more so. We have to
Mhm.
start behaving like tech, be agile, respond to changes in market conditions, and start looking at our business model and having team in place to start thinking about payer. Will that
Mm.
insurance company actually pay us for our product? Will they approve that? That's been a large part of discussions on many conferences on the last 6 months. Investors are starting to wise up to this. They're asking those questions. And that I
Right,
think is even more important for your family office. What's the trial of an impact? How long does it last? What are the variables associated with it in order for it to achieve success? And is the team you're investing in have commercial launch experience? Those are
Mm.
things we used to not discuss at all in early stage clinical investment.
Right. And if we try to make it even more practical, if you were advising a new founder entering early stage clinical pharma today, what maybe one or two strategic choices would most increase their odds of making it to a pivotal trial?
I would be leveraging digital, agentic AI
Mm.
much sooner. Again, these companies didn't even think about that. Now it's a requirement. The other thing I would say is look at the makeup of your board. Before, these early stage clinical boards leaned very heavily on the founders, on scientists. It's got to go beyond that. You have to start, like I said, engaging digital, start thinking about commercial. What's the payer experience on your board? You need all of
Mm.
these things, and it's kind of where we as an industry have not been keeping up with the times.
Right. And of course, everything that you mentioned before, none of that matters if you can execute it in the reality. So clinical trial design is evolving, becoming more adaptive and patient-centric. But for a resource-constrained biotech, what does a good trial design actually look like today?
Well, I think you're thinking about digital quickly
Mm,
and more often than it used to be.
right.
Agentic AI is bringing a lot to the table. I mean, I know we've been discussing it theoretically for the last few years. It's happening now. How can I acquire the patients for my trial, those participants? We've seen many a trial fail just because it simply could not acquire the participants it needed. Now you can use agentic AI to scan electronic health records. So we start to identify these opportunities for trials and patient participation much sooner and in more unique manners than we used to look at.
Yes. And this is where technology often comes into the conversation, as you mentioned, the digital part. Where does digital or AI realistically come into play for those early stage clinical companies?
So, we're seeing it happen more in drug development itself. I think for a company that's not starting with drug development and AI in mind, then you need to start looking at where are the opportunities to create operation efficiencies.
Mhm.
And you also need to start looking at, again, that patient engagement. How do I get these trial participants to come on board so I can actually trigger my trial? But the big thing is, this was, again, not a part of discussion of early stage clinical even 2 years ago. This is how quickly things are changing, which is why I keep, at least when I'm engaging with CEOs that I sit on boards, we need to get to digital sooner. Let's leverage it. Let's lower our costs. Let's make things happen faster.
Mhm.
Uh, Unlike traditional tech, we have even more regulatory or compliance, but we can't look at that as an excuse anymore. We
Right.
look at how does the digital help us achieve our objective.
And beyond the trial and technology we just talked about, leadership structure also matters a lot. How should those early stage clinical boards reflect today's investment and business environment?
Well, I think there's a few places they can be doing that. They need to be doing that specifically with gender. It's interesting to watch a medication targeted at females, women
Mhm.
who are very important consumers to all of us, and see a board that's all male, top heavy. So gender alone is one area. Also specialties. Like I said, we need to start bringing in that commercial knowledge, that payer knowledge, so that we are doing the best things we can do for our investors.
And finally, zoom out a little bit. Where does global strategy come into play for early stage clinical companies today?
So it's interesting. We're in, some people would define as chaotic times. I think
Mhm.
we're in a time of opportunity.
Right,
Again, an early stage clinical would have never been considering a global footprint. Now we can do that. Technology can do that. Zoom can do that. We have teams all over the world in early stage clinical, and everyone used to have to physically be in the office. Now
right.
we have technology letting us leverage who's the best talent to help us achieve our goals. Where are they located? Does that really matter? Depending upon the role, it does. But in many cases, we can access lower costs, better knowledge, better market experience than we could ever do that before. So again, I think these early stage clinicals need to start thinking global.
Dennis, thank you so much for sharing your perspective today.